area and as many men that he could find in these units and all of their histories. And that's for upstairs. That's not for this. Local people input, thank you. And St. Mary's school book, or church book, copies of the Watertown Times, and other museum sources and library sources and historians' office sources. I would like to say that personally I have been to Virginia quite a few times, which is where a lot of the Civil War took place, and I've been to the Confederate Museum in Richmond, and we don't think about it up north too much, but if you go to the Confederate Museum, it's a whole different picture and story that they tell, of course. And they really did believe in what they fought for as well as the Union. And it just gave me a little different perspective, being interested in the Civil War, of going to the Confederate Museum in Richmond, Virginia. And I just thought I would mention that. Another thing I'd like to mention is that the Grand Army of the Republic was a organization formed in the 1880s to get recognition for the men's service and to help get them a pension, to help the families, to help other veterans who needed help. And they were very instrumental in getting the Pledge of Allegiance put into the schools, which was very important. They became very, very patriotic. And if there was a veteran who was ill or he had died and his family was destitute or in need, the GAR was there to help these people with donations, with food, and so forth. And because they were so generous of their time and money and their efforts to help other veterans, the organization became very strong. And eventually, of course, the veterans all passed away. The last one in our area was from the town of Antwerp, and he died in 1944. He was 98 years old, Sam Van Pelt. Well, once these veterans died off, the organization ceased to exist. So the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars took over where that left off. And that's what we have today, is the American Legion and the Foreign Legion, or Foreign Legion, the veterans. They also were, the GAR was also very aware of Memorial Day and the anniversary of Appomattox, the firing on Fort Sumter, and they always made sure that they had a celebration or a parade or a picnic, and they were very dedicated on Declaration Day or Remembrance Day and things like that. So they were really an active organization for many years, and of course we don't think much of it. What do the initials stand for? Grand Army of the Republic. What did they do? Well, that's what they did. They were the veterans' vehicle to get a pension, which finally came about in the 1890s. And the men that lived into the 1920s were getting around $20 to $22 a month. I have several pension certificates here that tell as each year went by, the pension got maybe another 50 cents a month in a pension benefit. The last local veteran to pass away was Tom Collins. He was born in Sackett's Harbor, and his family moved to Clayton, and then he grew up and enlisted in the service and served with a unit out of Sackett's Harbor, New York. We have his obituary over here on the far left, your far right, and he had many relatives in this area. And then Mr. Bazinat was another local veteran who passed away just the week before he did in 1932. I have a lot of papers from Mr. Bazinat, as well as a picture of him in the service. And then in late years, this picture was taken right here where the town hall sits now in what was a shipyard. He's standing at the stern of a ship that sat here, and he was a boat builder, and he lived up near the custard stand where the Jimmy Flanders lives today. And he's a relative of the Wood family, and my Aunt Roselma Wagner, who was a Wood, let me borrow these pictures. And there's discharge papers, pension papers, and a promotion to first sergeant paper. And his name was actually Bezanet. He was born in Oakville, Ontario, came over here, changed his name to John Bezanet in later years. But even in these papers, it's Bezanet. So that was another thing that the genealogy people run into, is the change of names as people became Americanized. A lot of Canadian men came over here and joined the service and fought in the Civil War. And then this copy of a discharge paper is for a Norman Gardner who was born in Clayton, but he didn't stay in Clayton. He went in the service, and he eventually he was married and lived in Gananoque, Ontario, and is buried in Gananoque, Ontario. And I got a genealogy inquiry about him, and that's how I found out this, and I got a copy of his discharge papers. So he never really lived here after he got out of the service. Now, I've just gotten a roster for the 94th Volunteer Infantry Regiment from Sackett's Harbor, from Joan House, and it was from her great-grandfather, Aaron House, who joined the 94th from the town of Worth. The recruiters would go around the towns and villages and counties and see if they could raise a regiment of men, which would be about 100 people. If they couldn't get 100 men, they might join forces with some other group, and they would get 100 people together and then go and be sworn in, maybe at Sackett's Harbor or in Boonville. In my great-grandfather's case, he joined the service from New Bremen, but down at Boonville, New York, served 3 years in the service and came home and settled in New Bremen. And he fought at Gettysburg, as I have found out a lot of men did, and lived to be in his 80s. I don't have them here, but I've got copies of pension papers for his widow, Evangeline, and describes the unit he was in, the 97th Infantry. But the point was, the recruiters would go around Clayton, Lafargeville, Alexandria Bay, and wherever, and see if they could get 100 men together. And usually the recruiter or the man in charge would be a person of influence in the community, like a banker or some other businessman or a lawyer. In some cases, it's been written that these people were the ones that would get patriotic, get a group of men together, go to Sackett's Harbor, walk to Watertown, march to Watertown, get on the train and go south. And they would invariably end up down around Washington, D.C., or Baltimore, Maryland, and then they'd go out into Virginia or wherever. Another noticeable thing I think is noticeable is that there was very few naval people. Of course, when the war started, there was no Navy. The Navy had been disbanded after the War of 1812. Then they made up a Navy again. One man, Joseph Consall. Now, the Consall name was a common, well-known name in the community. He joined the Navy and he was on a gunboat, the Mound City, and the notation was that he died in service. Now, he may not have died of wounds, he may have died of illness or something like that, but he did die in the service. And like I say, there's very few mentions of any naval personnel in the Civil War, although they ran the blockade, of course, and there was a Navy, but not many men from this area apparently joined the Navy. Now, Solomon Frame was a doctor in Clayton, as well as 3 other family members. There was a Dr. Frame in DePauville, Solomon Frame in DePauville, and then 2 other Frame men that were doctors in this area at one time. Solomon Frame served in the 10th Heavy Artillery as a surgeon out of Sackett's Harbor, and served 3 years, came home and set up his practice again. And I mentioned Joseph Consall. Now, John Grandy, the Grandy name used to be more prevalent. There's very few Grandys left in the area, but he was from Grindstone, and he died in the service of wounds. There were 2 Graveses. The Graves family was a large family in the area at one time. Tom Graves, Sam Graves, they both died in service. Lorenzo Marcellus, Doris Bertrand ancestor. And she has brought us a picture of Lorenzo Marcellus in the service. Would have been a great-grandfather? Just your grandfather. Or just, I say just. He also was in the 94th out of Sackett's Harbor, New York. And he was taken prisoner. And he was in 3 different prisons, and he lost a leg in the service. One prison that he was in, which fairly commonly known, was Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia, which was very infamous for the treatment. And he was in Andersonville, which is also another infamous Confederate prison. So, and he came home, and there was brothers that served also in the Civil War. There's a George Orman. The name is not known anymore, but he was a prisoner at Libby and finally released. James Lytell from this area. There are copies of letters here on the table from the surgeons in the hospital to his wife and then to his sister, eventually telling about his passing away in that hospital of the wounds that he had suffered someplace in Virginia. Those are just some of the local veterans, and this book of Mr. Sanderson's is Whispers from the Past, and it's right full of names, and he's constantly updating this, and there's another printing right now of the book updated, and it will be available at some point. And he's got a lot of personal stories in there, and veterans or people that served in different regiments, alphabetically, where they joined up. Just for instance, here's a John Frazier. The Fraziers used to be a name in town. He joined up in Clayton, and he was killed in action. And there was a survivor's pension paid to the family. And he was buried, or the GAR took care of the burial. And Ellisburg, Pamelia, Town of Worth, Aaron House, Town of Worth, and honorable discharge, veterans pension, and a member of the GAR. There was very few veterans who did not join the GAR because it was such a powerful force for them to get what they needed for benefits. This book, if anybody's interested, is well worth getting a hold of because of what the information that is in it. Now, Mr. Levi Denny was a veteran. Very interesting story. He was born in Cato Landing, Ontario. Or no, I'm sorry, Quebec. And by trade, he was a carpenter. At the time the Civil War started, he moved to Clayton. He enlisted in 1862, and he was 23 years old. He joined up over in Sackets Harbor in the 94th Infantry. So he left behind his wife, a father, and a father-in-law, and 7 children, and he was 23 years old. That's so no wonder he went to war. So that was just something I picked up on. They made a mistake in here about his age before the war, after the war, but only by 2 years. So even at the most, he was 25 with 7 children. But he actually was 23 when he joined the service, and he already had 7 children. So he was at Fort Lyon, which was near, at that time, it was near Washington, D.C. And he got a letter from his wife that they were destitute. The father-in-law was sick. The father was sick. There was no money coming in. And they needed money. They needed food. So he asked for a leave to go home so he could help his family. The leave was denied. He deserted. He came home and was helping his family. He went to work as a carpenter again and made some money. And along comes the army from Watertown and took him into custody, took him back, and court-martialed him. And they were going to brand him on his hip with a big letter D. But these letters of recommendation from his colonel and brigade commander brought to light the reason for his desertion. At the time, he was making $16 a month, and he was sending most of it home. But it never got to his wife. Somebody in the post office was intercepting the money in the envelope. And this all came to light later, after he was back in the service, had been wounded, and was in a hospital. So he was exonerated of any desertion charges. Now, it goes on to say, during the Battle of Gettysburg, he was injured, and he was hospitalized in West Philadelphia. And eventually he died of those wounds and is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. But and at the time he died, the death certificate stated that he was 23 years old. But that was a 2-year discrepancy. Then the restitution was made for the missing funds. So I'm sure that this Levi Denny is probably one of the Dennys. The Denny family still is a name in this area. Just to back up a little bit, there was a whole list of units in this area. The 35th New York Volunteer Infantry was the first to be organized in the area, and they went into service in 1861. The 94th New York Volunteer Infantry went into service in 1862, and it was a very large unit. The roster is very large for that unit. Now, they marched to Watertown, got on the train, and just south of Albany, the train was in a wreck. They lost all of their equipment, guns and whatever, and the band that was traveling with them lost most of their instruments. One person died in that train accident. So eventually they got into Washington, D.C., and they got re-equipped and went on to serve in the Army. The 20th New York Volunteer Cavalry started service in 1863. And then the 10th, they were Sackett's Harbor. 10th New York Heavy Artillery, 1862. The 14th New York Heavy Artillery out of Sackett's Harbor. And the 1st New York Regiment of Light Artillery, they went into service in 1862. And then the 2nd New York Regiment of Heavy Artillery, I don't have a date on that, but they are all mentioned in these records of Gettysburg battles, and pretty near any place in the state of Virginia that you wanted to go is where most of these units were at one time or another. And some of them, as they went into battle, they lost a lot of men. So the units would be put in with other units, and whoever had the most men to start with, they absorbed that other unit and they failed to exist anymore. So the 20th and the 94th had a lot of casualties, but they kept absorbing other units. The 94th absorbed a unit from Leroy, New York, near Buffalo, which was like the 135th. And in this way, they kept their ranks up to an acceptable level by taking in these other units that couldn't maintain their levels. And in my great-grandfather's case, I went to Manassas to the Battlefield Tourist Center, and they looked on the map for the 97th, and they immediately knew that the 97th had taken so many casualties, they had been placed with another unit, and they showed me exactly on the map where they had fought and held the line, et cetera, et cetera. But this is what happened to a lot of these units. So as you read Civil War history, some of the units disappeared and were absorbed by somebody else. Also, another item is that some people could join up for 1 year and get out if they lived, and they could join up again or do whatever, but they didn't have to go back again. Some people joined up for 3 years. Now, some people joined up for 1 year, and some people thought they joined up for 1 year, and they actually joined up for 3 years. So things like that happened and are mentioned in history. So one man in particular joined up twice, John Green. He was in the 35th Heavy Artillery, probably a 1-year enlistment, got out, and then he joined up again and joined another unit and was wounded and finally got out of the service. And he did not die in the service, but he was wounded, but he was in the service twice. But with that 1-year enlistment, they could do that. And then at some point during the Civil War, some states were offered bonuses to join up. Or a man could serve for somebody else. If that man had been drafted and didn't want to go, he could pay this man $300 and he could go in his stead. And that was quite common, because a well-to-do person could pay some person to go and fight for him. And that happened after the conscription thing started, the draft. So there's all kinds of stories that we don't think about nowadays that have to do with the Civil War era. There were brothers, complete families. There were Colin brothers, 2 Livingston brothers that were relatives of the Garnseys on Grindstone. They were in the service. And Joshua Calhoun was from Grindstone. He only served 60 days. He joined up during the last month of the war. They kept him an extra month. By staying in 60 days, he qualified for veterans benefits. And he lived till 1927, and he died of an accidental gunshot wound while he was out hunting one day. But he was one of the Calhoun relatives in this area. Now, I'd like to talk about Joseph Langevin, who was the Medal of Honor winner in this area. I've always had my mother talked about Uncle Joe this and Uncle Joe that, and I never knew who Uncle Joe was. Well, it turns out it was Uncle Joseph Langevin, who married one of my mother's great aunts. And he lived to be in his 80s, and he was quite a storyteller, and he was a boat person around Clayton and lived on the river all his life. He had a large family, but in the genealogy review, he had 4 or 5 sons, and none of them lived past 4 years of age. But all the daughters grew up and married, and that's where my mother's side of the family comes in. So the Langevin family is related to the Leverys and the Turgeons and various other families here in the village and in the area. George Levery has the Congressional Medal of Honor in a safe deposit box. There is a copy of it and a picture of it over in this room here with Mr. Langevin meeting General Pershing at the ceremony for the unknown soldier in Washington, D.C. in 1921. So he was our local celebrity as well as being a relative. So I started looking for Joseph Langevin history. And I went to Virginia on a trip to see my daughters, and I kept looking for this place that this had taken place, where he did this. He swam across the river and retrieved a barge so that the Union forces could go across and attack a Confederate outpost on the Blackwater River, and it's way down in southern Virginia, almost into North Carolina. Well, I never got to that place, but I did stop at Petersburg Battlefield Visitor Center, and they had an original battle or skirmish report from that, the day that it happened, October 15th through the 17th, 1864. And they were protecting the perimeter around Portsmouth, Virginia. And the Union Army was putting all their effort into dislodging General Lee out of Petersburg, Virginia, which they finally did in the spring. They starved him out. They cut off all the railroad lines into Petersburg, and General Lee had to flee in the middle of the night. The Union forces didn't even know he'd left. And about 9 days later, they caught up with him at Appomattox, and it was all over. But this expedition was, they took a regiment of people, and they went to see what they could do about doing away with this outpost on the Blackwater River. And once they got there, this cable barge was on the other side of the river. And so Joseph Langevin volunteered for the second time to do this. He'd done this once before, according to the report. So he gets in the river and he swims across under fire, brings the barge back, and the unit gets horses and men on board. They go over and they did away with the Confederate outpost. They captured supplies, weapons, telegraph key, 100 head of cattle, which helped feed their army for quite a while after that. And if he'd had any schooling, they would have promoted him to an officer, or at least to a sergeant. But he was not, he couldn't read or write. He was 19 years old. So all they did was give him the Congressional Medal of Honor. But he not only did this once, but he did this twice. And they did wipe out the Confederate outpost at that time on the Blackwater River. And I've since found out that it's just south of Franklin, Virginia, which it just happens that a year ago this past spring, they had the floods in Franklin, Virginia. And the water, they're in quite a deep valley, and the Blackwater River flooded right up above the windows and almost destroyed the little city of Franklin. But at least I found out where it was, even though I've never been there. And this Bernard's Mills or Murphy Station does not even exist anymore on the maps. but I was given a copy of the map at Petersburg that shows where this was. And so I would hope someday maybe I'd get there. But in 1921, Uncle Joe had a chance to go to Washington, D.C. to be at the commemoration of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So his daughter said, "Do you want me to go with you?" And he said, "Oh, no, I can do it." And he was in his 80s then. So he went to Washington, D.C. all by himself, and he was walking around down there dressed up in a suit with his medal on. Well, he was spotted by General Pershing and these other dignitaries, and that's why he got the picture taken. And they took care of all his expenses and made a big to-do about him being there with his medal on and so forth. And we have a color picture as well as those other pictures in there. This is all on display up at the American Legion, and there's been a nice stone erected at the cemetery for him and so forth. And I have a copy out of the Congressional Medal of Honor booklet that is here in the museum of that page with his name and a brief mention of his activities there. So, nope, wrong page. Actually, that's about the end of the presentation, except that I would say, starting here, there's pages that list veterans or list people that served, but it's not complete. There's several different sources. One is Strau's History, Jefferson County, and then another one over there is the St. Mary's Catholic Church book, which has other names, especially the old spellings of some of the names, which is interesting. Then we have the 1961 Watertown Daily Times, which is their anniversary, 100th anniversary, and what they covered in the Civil War. There's two different pages there that cover that. And Mr. Marcellus's picture, and Mr. Gibbons, who was another local veteran, Andrew Jackson Gibbons, born in 1837, died in 1897, and he was in Company G of the 56th New York Volunteer Infantry, which was not a local unit, but wherever it was that he joined up, he eventually settled in this area. I have a roster here from Aaron House, who was Joan House's great-grandfather, of the 94th Company C from Sackett's Harbor. His name is on there as a private. There are corporals and the other officers listed on this roster, and we put it in plastic today and kind of tender. It's been rolled up for years and it's dried out. In pretty good shape considering. Then, like I say, I mentioned this book of Mr. Sanderson's, which is at the printers right now, the third edition. Mr. Asnat's discharge, pension papers, and promotion papers. Also, I've got an envelope here with Mr. Charles Blanchard's name on it, and it looks like an absentee ballot envelope. And it certifies that he is in the Company H, 2nd Regiment, New York Volunteer Artillery at Petersburg, signed by officers and Mr. Blanchard, testifying that he is physically there, but he's a resident of New York State. And it appears to me to be a absentee ballot, which is, I think, kind of unusual. It's an envelope for an absentee ballot. I have Mr. Gardner's discharge papers, Mr. Bazanet's picture, and, oh, here's the color picture of the display at the American Legion here in town of Joseph Langevin, General Pershing, the picture of the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is a copy of the original, and a declaration about that. I have maps of Gettysburg battle, the second and third day's battle. I have the 2 volumes with some copies of different pages from the 97th, the 94th, and some of the other cavalry units that fought at Gettysburg. And I have a George Oliver Woodard. I didn't know where this came from, but I've just found out that one of the ladies here is a relative. There's letters home from him to his father and mother, and some of the letters came from a hospital. He evidently was wounded or sick and eventually recovered. And somebody donated that, and somebody must have this picture. Now, another tidbit that I ran into is that they had hospital ships as well as regular hospitals, and they had prisoner of war ships. They took these big ships and just threw everybody on there, put them out in the middle of the river or the ocean, and of course you couldn't escape. The Sultana was originally a prisoner of war ship in the Mississippi River. Shortly after the war was over, it was bringing these prisoners back home to be released, and it blew up, and 2,100 men died on that ship. It was the largest maritime disaster to ever happen, and it was a result of the Civil War. But there was a lot of these hospital ships and also prisoner of war ships. The hospitals would vary in size from 4,500 beds to only 15 beds, a little one here and a little one there, depending on what happened. There's a card from Gettysburg titled "The Valley of Death at Little Round Top," with a very, very traumatic battle. Pictures from Grindstone, the cemetery on Grindstone that they've dug out of the brush, called the Civil War Cemetery because there are Civil War veterans buried in it. And the very good color photography, very clear, because it's hard to read the stones, but they take better pictures than in actually looking at them to get the shadows just right. Now, this cemetery looks a lot better today than it did back when these pictures were taken, because Mr. Manley Rusho has gotten over there, and he runs the lawnmower about every week in there now. So that cemetery and the Sons of the American Legion have put a monument or a stone marker and a flagpole there. So every Memorial Day, the service is held on Grindstone at that cemetery for the Civil War veterans. We have a tin cup. Belonged to Mr. Charles Rickett. This was his mess cup. It sure is a mess. But this cup they carried with them, and they boiled coffee, they cooked soup, whatever, and this was their mainstay. It was their mess kit. And we have a hat. Came from a lady that also donated copies of bullets used in the Civil War. These are museum pieces. And that about, anybody got any questions? That's about it. Like I said, we would like input. Anybody got any family stories or whatever, we're certainly welcome. I got a couple of them just today, came in. And yes, ma'am.
I had a great-grandfather that was in the Civil War. I don't know which outfit he was in, but he and another guy were in Libby Prison, and they killed a guard and escaped.
Wow.
And then there was the Coleman brothers from Rodman, and they're buried up at the Rodman Cemetery. They have a double headstone.
Yeah. Okay.
And they were both wounded at Gettysburg and died of their wounds. And then their letters home, it didn't sound like one of them was wounded that badly. He was wounded in the hand and the arm, so evidently he got
Maybe, yeah. That brings up another point. My wife and I and sister-in-law and brother-in-law, we were driving around one day and we got over on the Pink Schoolhouse Road over the other side of Lafargeville and found a little cemetery. It had been well taken care of and so forth. And a lot of the stones in there were Civil War veterans from that area. But it's over on the Pink Schoolhouse Road. And I didn't really remember any names. Well, no, it'd be a private. Yeah, right, yeah. Right. Yeah. Oh, excuse me. His yes. The original Mr. Grant in the area, he actually didn't come from Clayton, but he settled in Clayton. After the Civil War, he's responsible for the Grant family being in this area, and he's responsible for the bank in Clayton along with Mr. Barker, and he also was a farmer, but he also had an interest in almost every cheese factory in the North Country, even including the Grindstone cheese factory. He was on the board of directors or in the co-op, and all these little Limburger factories and regular cheddar cheese factories for miles around. Mr. Grant was a shareholder in those, and the Grant name, of course, is very prominent in this area even to this day. And he was an officer in the 92nd Volunteer Infantry, which was not a local unit, but he eventually settled in this unit, or in this area.
Did you see CBS News last night?
No, I didn't.
The Hunley.
Oh, yes, they raised one of the first metal ships. It was made out of scrap. It was made out of plates from old boilers, and it sank a ship, and it sank itself also. But it's in very good shape according to the article, and so forth.
Speaking about that, on the news last night about the submarine, they showed a picture of it, and it said that it torpedoed this boat. Well, the torpedo was all fastened. It wasn't a torpedo that shot out. It was fastened to the front of the boat. So when it torpedoed the boat, in fact, they said it was a suicide mission. And it was attached to the front of the submarine. And when the submarine smashed into the boat, of course, the boat was destroyed, but also the submarine. Now, when they brought it up, they said that it is still enclosed. There are men's bodies inside this, and they're putting in a specially tank which has very, very, very ice cold water, and eventually they are going to open it. There will be remains of people in this submarine.
They didn't know just exactly how come it sank.
Well, as I found out, there's a lot of stories from the Civil War, and I just like to mention again, there's the other side of the story down south. And you have to appreciate what they believed in, too.
You know, we had, you always hear about Andersonville, the Southern prison, that, you know, we had one almost as bad here in New York.
Well, Elmira,
They didn't call it Elmira, the Southern prisons called it Elmira.
yeah, there you go. No, I didn't know that, but that figures. Violet.
My great uncle was in the Civil War,
Yeah.
and he's buried in Alexander Bay. But he was taken prisoner in Andersonville, you know, that prison.
Right.
And then he developed TB, but he was sent home and he died and was buried in Alexander Bay.
Right. Now, what was his name?
John Dobbins.
Dobbins. Okay. Right. Yeah. Probably in this book. Yeah. Carol.